Louise Haigh, welcome to Acting Prime Minister, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. It's lovely to see you.
I can see you there in your parliamentary office, and you joined me after a pretty eventful week in Westminster. Where were you when you heard the news that Dominic Cummings had walked out the door?
Oh, right. I wasn't sure which one you were going to ask me that. It has been that eventful. You could have been asking me about a number of events this week. Where was I when I think I was at home in Sheffield. It was one of those things where I think my phone was actually in another room and I was doing something else, and you come back and you've got like 80 odd messages and those are Twitter notifications. You think, oh wow, something's really happened. It was an odd one though, because I was asked to go and do media interviews on it, and obviously I was really pleased that Dominic Cummings was out of number 10. But we were talking about it. I mean, it was a complete shambles. It was an absolute farce on the day that we'd hit 50,000 deaths. But it was just, I felt an odd dynamic because I was going out and criticising the government for it, but also I was really pleased that Dominic Cummings had left number 10. So it was very mixed feelings.
And it was kind of a weird photo of him leaving out the front door with the box, wasn't it? Because on the one hand, he likes to sort of put this image of him outside, out there, of a guy who doesn't really care what other people think of him. He doesn't care what he looks like. And it was quite, I don't know, there was a moment of sort of vanity, I think, about walking out the front with that box, wasn't there?
Very, very much so. It was very stage managed, wasn't it? And it does make me very suspicious about the extent to which he has really left, or what capacity he might still be advising or working with the government on potentially. I'm sure there are plenty of routes back in for him through various consultancies or outfits. So yeah, that was it. I was pretty suspicious about the nature of his departure.
Okay, well, look, you're going to need to select your own Downing Street advisors now, because we are making you Prime Minister for the next half an hour. So let's get you settled into number 10, first things first. What is the one item that you would take in there with you from home? Am
I allowed to bring my dogs? Can that be the item? Can I bring Harry and Lola? Yeah. So
what kind of dogs are Harry and Lola?
Lola is a golden doodle, and Harry is a bit of everything. He's a collie crossed with a whippet or a lurcher or something. They're both quite big and bouncy. So I don't know if we'd fit much else into number 10 after they've come in with me. It would be chaos. But yeah, I'm not leaving them behind.
Well, you need a drinks cabinet as well. You need space for that. And what is the drink that you'd pour yourself at night, or ask the butler to get you as you're reading through your red box?
I didn't know I get a butler as well. That's brilliant.
I might have made that up. I'm not sure there is a butler, to be honest. But
I am quite partial to an Irish whiskey. So I think it would be quite a peaty whiskey, maybe a Connemara.
Nice. And who's the first person you'd call?
So probably my mum. I mean, I have a sort of a long-standing joke that I could ring my mum up and tell her that I'd been made Prime Minister, and she'd be like, "That's nice. This is what the cat's been up to." Like, she keeps me very, very grounded. And I had a similar conversation with her when I was promoted to the Shadow Cabinet. I rang her up to tell her I was the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and she was like, "Very good." Like, what's your brother been up to today? So, I mean, I made her sound really sick. Like, she's not daft. She's a very clever woman. But yeah, I think it's very important to keep people around you that keep your feet on the ground, and she definitely does that.
Definitely. Well, let's talk a bit about your background and your upbringing now, because you were raised in Sheffield, and that's the city where you're now an MP. You were born into the Labour Party, really. Your grandfather and your uncle, I believe, were both trade union officials. You went to the independent Sheffield High School before studying politics at Nottingham University. And then after graduating, you worked in Parliament, as well as being a Unite shop steward and volunteering as a special constable in London. And then after a brief spell in the corporate sector, you became an MP in 2015, joining Keir Starmer's Shadow Cabinet earlier this year. So is it true to say that you were sort of born into the Labour Party? Was it quite a political upbringing?
No, not in the slightest. And I don't think I'd met anyone who was actually in the Labour Party until I joined the Labour Party in my teens. My family were political in different ways, never through party politics. But my immediate family weren't really particularly political. It was always just there in the background. So, as I mentioned, my granddad worked for the fire service. He wasn't a firefighter because he lost his leg in the war. He worked in the control room. But he was very active in the FBU. My uncle, my mum's brother, was a striking miner, so very, very involved in the NUM, and never worked again after the mines closed in the early 90s. My grandma was born and brought up in Spain, and then her family had to flee the Spanish Civil War, and my mum's other sister moved to apartheid South Africa to fight against apartheid and to be very politically active and involved alongside the ANC. So I had these very interesting people and always around me in my family that made me very political and gave me a very political outlook and a very internationalist outlook, I would say, as well. But it wasn't actually until at school I had a very left-wing economics teacher who kind of moulded my ideas into a party political shape and made me realise that my home was the Labour Party. So that was where I joined and became active in Sheffield. And then, as you say, I actually started my degree at the London School of Economics, but I didn't get on with it at all, so I transferred into Nottingham. And then it was from there that I got a job working for the MP for Nottingham and moved back down to London again. So I've always been, since my mid-teens, been very, very political and very party political. And it's just an incredible, it's very trite to say, isn't it? But it's an incredible honour to serve and to represent my home city and to represent my friends and family at home.
What is your kind of earliest political memory? Was there something that brought you into politics, do you think?
I think, so I mean, I was obviously I was 10 when we won the election. I certainly remember that.
The 97 election, the Tony Blair landslide, yeah, 97.
Exactly. And I remember the mood of euphoria and the incredible changes that came. I was in my primary school, in a local primary school, educated in the kind of mobile classrooms because we just they didn't have the investment, they didn't have the good buildings and the infrastructure because education had been cut so heavily for so many years. So it was growing up under a Labour government transformed my city and the families of so many people in Sheffield. So, but it wasn't really, I don't think I can point to a particular event that brought me into politics. I mean, I joined the Labour Party not long after the Iraq War, even though I was completely opposed to it and bunked off school and marched against it. But I still could see that Labour most closely fit my values, even though they weren't doing things all the time that I completely agreed with or I completely actively opposed in that case.
And is your political leaning the reason why you dye your hair red?
Well, it's more actually like orange and pink at the moment, isn't it? So I have to be careful in my new role if my hair is particularly orange that I'm wearing some green as well at the same time.
Because of the Northern Ireland factor, yeah, of course, yeah. You need your political impartiality.
My appearance as well as my political approach.
Absolutely. I only ask you about your hair.
My hair is naturally red, so it's just very, very much enhanced.
Yeah, I only ask you about your hair because I see you often sort of tweeting people and having to bat away ridiculous comments.
It really enrages a section of right-wing Twitter. It's a particular demographic of kind of older man that really take offence to my hair, and it just encourages me to do it even wilder every time, to be honest.
How dare you dye your hair the colour that you want it? Well, look, when you were elected in 2015, you were the youngest Labour MP, but you didn't get to hold that title for long because we had the 2017 election and now we've had the 2019 election. They're very, very young, this new intake. And lots of the new intake are kind of from the Corbynite wing of the party. Do you feel as though it's a bit of a Corbynite clique that sort of entered in 2019?
I mean, you're absolutely right in that there is the Parliamentary Labour Party, and actually Parliament as a whole is so much younger and so much more diverse in every single possible way. Different class backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, a significant number of LGBT MPs now that are representing. And I noticed that actually when I came in 2015, it was still pretty young. I was the youngest Labour MP, but there were Tories and of course Mari Black from the SNP, several other MPs that were younger. I think this intake in 2019 it is a young radical intake, and there's some incredible talent in it. I wouldn't describe them as a clique, and I get on very, very well with the vast majority of them. And Olivia Blake is my parliamentary neighbour in Sheffield Hallam. She's a very good friend of mine. We've worked together over very many years. And although we, differ on some points and have differed already in Parliament, we're still able to get on, and it's not, it's not the kind of bitter factional place that the PLP has been over the last 5 years. It feels like we're able to disagree more comradely than has been my experience since 2015.
Because you nominated Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, I mean, how do you feel about that in hindsight?
I've thought about this a lot, as you can imagine. I nominated him because I really believe that a huge number of people wanted to support him and wanted to hear his ideas, and his ideas were an important part of the debate. I think he then inspired millions of people to join the Labour Party, and that was positive. However, it is very difficult to overstate the impact that the anti-Semitism crisis that's engulfed the Labour Party under his leadership has had on the Jewish community and on Labour's historic relationship with the Jewish community. And on that basis alone, I think I have to say, yes, I do regret nominating him.
I mean, obviously, he's had the whip withdrawn as well from him, and Keir Starmer decided not to reinstate the whip this week. Do you feel as if that's the right decision?
I think, given his response to the HRC report, which, as I say, again, it's hard to overstate how damaging that has been and how devastating it is for me as a Labour MP, as a Labour member, for the body that we set up in government to oversee the Human Rights Act as found as in breach of equality law. I just find, I'm so ashamed. And for Jeremy to respond in the way he did was appalling. And I think it left Keir with very little choice than to keep the whip off him this week, because he's refused to sort of acknowledge his role in it and to properly apologise. And until we repair those links and the trust with the Jewish community, we're still going to be talking about this, and we need that focus to be on that, looking to the future and looking to put in place the right processes and tackle the culture in the party that has allowed this to thrive.
I mean, the leader of the Unite Union, Len McCluskey, said this week that removing the whip was a vindictive and vengeful action that added up to persecution of Jeremy Corbyn. Are you worried about Unite withdrawing its funding from Labour, maybe over this?
Look, if Len McCluskey wants to threaten funding for the Labour Party because we're wanting to tackle anti-Semitism, then that's a pretty sorry state of affairs. I don't think there's any serious threats of that on the table. But it's absolutely right. Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner were both elected with mandates to take a zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, and we can't just say those words. We have to act, and we have to make them mean something. And so that's, we're left with no option than to take this course.
And how does it feel under Keir Starmer now? Does it feel like a very different party? Do you feel like it's a more electable party? Are you quite excited at the moment about Labour's prospects?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we're so separate from the electorate. Normally I'll be out chatting to people and out and about and knocking on doors in Sheffield. It's really difficult to get a sense of how people are feeling, and obviously we're so distrustful of the polls. But it has been brilliant to see the poll gap close so dramatically over the last few months. It does feel different. Jeremy's leadership and the leadership of the over the last 5 years was not good. It wasn't a good place to be on the front bench under his leadership. There wasn't good debate or discussion. It was a nightmare to get decisions out of, and this is all a matter of public record. I've read some of Gabriel and Patrick's Left Out book, and it's a pretty accurate description of the frustrations we had of dealing with some of the figures that were around Jeremy Corbyn, and all of that's gone. It feels much more discursive, much more open to debate, and it's just a much better party to be involved in.
Okay, well, look, let's put Keir Starmer's bid to be Prime Minister to one side for a moment and get back to you being Prime Minister. And one of the big challenges that you would face as Prime Minister is holding the Union together, which is going to be one of Boris Johnson's big tests. Obviously, you're Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, so I guess this is something that you spend a lot of time thinking about. And when there are calls for a second independence referendum in Scotland, a border poll in Northern Ireland, even now quite a sort of serious campaign for independence in Wales, how do you think you try and hold the union together as Prime Minister? It's a huge question, but have you got any ideas about what you'd want to do?
Yeah, and I think it's all of this, as I say, even in Wales, which has not been those calls and that movement hasn't been as vocal as it is, but because of the way that the Tories have governed us through this crisis, or failed to govern us through this crisis, I think it is just exacerbating those divisions completely. So in response to COVID, but also in response to Brexit, and we see that all the time in Northern Ireland, of course, it just puts the constitutional question right back on the table and is right at the centre of the debate. And of course, both sides of the constitutional question in Northern Ireland are trying to exploit it in different ways. I'll get really frustrated seeing the DUP kind of raise concerns, very legitimate concerns around the protocol and the border down the Irish Sea. But it was completely inevitable that something like this had to be in place on leaving the European Union. So they've not kind of helped themselves in the unionist approach in that sense. They've backed themselves into something of a corner. But it does mean that constitutional question is alive in Northern Ireland in a way that it hasn't been in recent years. And it's certainly public opinion is stronger now because of Brexit than it has been. So it is a concern. And it's a concern because there are also lots of other issues on the horizon in Northern Ireland, not least the centenary next year of the creation of Northern Ireland, which will be a very, very divisive issue for communities. And I'm worried about the way our government here is approaching it. The executive there is pretty unstable as well. At the moment, they are having very sort of deep political divides over their approach to COVID. So we've got quite a toxic combination, and talking about the constitutional future in the middle of all that is clearly not helpful. So I think really in terms of the approach to the union and holding it together, you need a government that respects the devolved settlement, and it's quite clear that Boris Johnson doesn't, that he doesn't understand devolution, he doesn't care about it, he doesn't respect it. And that's just shown up in sort of small ways all the time. For example, like when England, basically, when London went into lockdown, then furlough could be extended. But Northern Ireland had been in circuit breaker previously, and there was no talk about furlough being extended at all. The UK internal market bill just rode a coach and horses through the devolution settlement without much of a blink of an eye. And there's very few Tory voices that are speaking up for it. So you need a government and a Prime Minister that's going to take devolution seriously and have those voices at the table so that you can have a proper four nations approach. And certainly in Scotland and Wales, I think you probably devolve more powers as well to make sure that they felt that they had control but were respected by the union.
I mean, Boris Johnson did say this week that devolution had been a disaster, which was interpreted quite broadly, and I wasn't in the room, we don't know exactly what he meant, but what Downing Street are arguing he meant is that it's been a disaster in terms of fuelling demand for independence in Scotland, because the SNP government has obviously come into power, and they argue that the SNP has now made independence its obsession. And there is something in that, isn't there, for a unionist? If you look at Wales, for example, during the pandemic, the way it's handled the pandemic and sort of made its mark in terms of its own individual policy making has really highlighted, the possibilities available to a country if they go their own way, and similarly in Scotland. So do you think maybe devolution has been a disaster for unionism, even if it's been well received in those nations and is now well loved, I suppose, in those nations to a degree?
Yeah, no, not at all. I think devolution is really important. It's a really important legacy of the last Labour government. It's I believe profoundly ability to make decisions as locally as possible, and a Scottish Parliament is surely going to make better decisions for Scotland than Westminster is able to. But I think I don't think devolution in itself has fueled independence. I think Nicola Sturgeon is clearly a very impressive politician. Her approval ratings have been extremely good during the COVID crisis, even though actually on the actual cases and the way she dealt with it, it's not been much of an improvement at all on how Boris Johnson and how England has fared. But the SNP are very good, and they are very good at exploiting political issues to further independence. I don't think that was a necessary result of devolution. I think that's because you've got the SNP there who are very strong, and we have failed spectacularly in Scotland over the last few years. Labour has been performing really poorly, and I think I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that over too many years we took it for granted.
Do you think we're looking at a border poll in Northern Ireland in the next 5 years or so? Does it feel like it's going that way?
I think we'll certainly face calls for a border poll. I think unlikely that soon, and it's certainly you listen to the Taoiseach and their approach that it's not on their agenda. That what they are focusing on is looking at shared issues across the island of Ireland and making sure that Northern Ireland is well governed and that the people of Northern Ireland are well looked after, because it is frustrating for kind of all the oxygen to be sucked out of Northern Ireland through obsession with the constitutional question, when actually the day-to-day lives of the people there are not comparable to the rest of the UK, because the health service is in desperate need of reform and investment. The education system is not particularly efficient or delivering results. I think it's 30% of kids in Northern Ireland don't leave Northern Ireland with 5 GCSEs. They don't leave education with 5 GCSEs. So there's really important policy issues to tackle, and we've been speaking to the Irish government about our shared objectives on those. And that's where the priority has to be. So, I think we just need all our political attention turned to that. And I think for too long from a British perspective, we just think of Northern Ireland through the constitutional lens and not actually about our responsibility to deliver in government terms.
And just one last question on Northern Ireland. Obviously, we've got the election of Joe Biden now as American president and Irish American. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of talk about how that perhaps plays into Brexit, but do you think it might play into the Northern Irish question as well, in terms of, maybe he would be more sympathetic to Irish reunification? What do you think?
I think it makes a huge difference, and he's clearly he's only got quite distant Irish heritage, but he's very, very proud of it. And I know that he and those around him play a close interest in Northern Ireland politics, not just around Brexit and the foreign policy elements, but around things like how the government are approaching dealing with the legacy of the Troubles and various policies on Northern Ireland. So I think that will play a huge part in government policy on Northern Ireland, which is about time, because frankly, over the last 10 years, more often than not, the government have been pretty reckless with their as custodians of the Good Friday Agreement. So it's really important that we have a US president that takes it as seriously as our government should.
Okay, well, look, of course, as Prime Minister, there are other issues on your desk, not least of all the pandemic. And there's been a lot of focus on Christmas this week and whether families should be able to get together at Christmas. What do you think? Are you kind of hoping that there will be respite at Christmas and that families will be able to come together? Would you let them if you were Prime Minister?
Well, of course we want to see people being able to see each other at Christmas. There's only like me, my mum and my brother in my family, so I'm sort of like jealous of these people that have these massive families that break the rule of 6. Of course we want to see people able to celebrate. I think the fundamental, people ask all the time, don't they, about what would Labour's approach and how would it have differed to the Tories on COVID, and I think there is a real question about our values and the different values that we have from the Tories and how that would have driven the response, because it felt right from the beginning that they just weren't taking it particularly seriously. And that was why they were so late to go into lockdown. And it's just been shocking to see them repeat the exact same mistakes in this second time round. We were calling for the circuit breaker on the advice of Sage weeks before they eventually accepted that it was necessary. And because of that, as Keir said over and over again, this lockdown is far longer and harder than it needed to be. And I worry that it won't be enough at this late stage for us to avoid restrictions over Christmas. But we'll now just have to make sure we play our part in trying to get that R rate down so that we can see each other.
And there was talk this week from the scientists of maybe one day of Christmas requiring 5 days of tighter restrictions. So if we had 5 days off with our families at Christmas, maybe we're looking at taking out the whole of January. Is it worth it? Do you think that would be worth it?
Well, I suppose it depends on your family, doesn't it? How much you like them.
You might be a bit bored of your brother and your mum by day 5 if you can't invite anyone else round.
Exactly. Happily embrace lockdown after 5 days. I think it's so difficult to say, and I really worry about people's mental health and also about the willingness to follow it. I really strongly get the impression that people aren't following this lockdown as strictly as the first, and that they're not abiding by the rules in the same way. And I don't think, we need to avoid relying on this as much as possible, because it's going to become less and less effective as a strategy, because the public just won't bear it for too much longer.
And obviously there's good news this week as well about a vaccine. We seem to have sort of 3 viable vaccines coming down the road now, or the Oxford vaccine at least is showing positive results this week. So as Prime Minister, would you make a vaccine compulsory?
No, I would feel deeply uncomfortable with that. I don't even know how sort of legally you would get around that. That makes me feel very uncomfortable. But I think the work that Joe Stevens and Jonathan Ashworth have been doing over the last week about tackling disinformation and misinformation on social media around the vaccine is really important, because I am seeing a real surge in that in my social media, and my constituents getting in touch sort of around anti-vax conspiracy theories, and that does really worry me. So we need to take urgent action on that. And it's something that Joe's been doing a lot of work on, because the government have been so lax on their online harms legislation. And of course, it's not just an issue for anti-vax, but for disinformation and for getting involved in elections, undermining elections, and online abuse and harm, etc., etc. So I think it's one of the most pressing policy priorities the government needs to tackle. It's certainly the first thing I would do if I was Prime Minister, is tackle social media responsibility.
Yeah, it's quite difficult for us as sort of established media to tackle, because if you start talking about it, then you almost feed the conspiracy theory, but equally you want to kind of take it down or challenge what's being said, so that the public can be informed by responsible media. It's very difficult. Yeah,
and education is obviously a really important part of it. And I understand people being queasy about it, because it does get into issues of free speech territory. But the point about social media amplifying these messages is that they make money out of the spread of conspiracy theory and disinformation. So it's not about stopping people expressing their views on it. It's about forcing social media companies to take responsibility for the amount and the speed at which these theories and misinformation is shared. And they have the ability to do that. But unfortunately, it's part of their business model. And that's why we need to legislate on it.
Okay, well, look, we're almost out of time here, Lou. So let's get some quick fire questions in before we finish. Who would you fear most across the dispatch box as Prime Minister, do you think? Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak?
Well, everyone likes Rishi. I mean, and he is lovely. He is a nice young man. So yeah, Rishi. I'd feel worse beating up Rishi. Not that I wouldn't do it. I would happily do it, but I would feel worse than beating up Boris.
I love that you say that Rishi's a nice young man, as if you're like 75 years old. He's older than you are. Right. What song would you come onto stage to at party conference, do you think?
Oh, well, it would have to be either an Arctic Monkey song or a Pulp song, really, wouldn't it? Maybe Common People or Disco 2000.
Both would be very good options. Where would you go on holiday as Prime Minister? Get that classic photograph.
I'm not doing the Gordon and wearing my suit on the beach in Filey or whatever. Can I just every year me and some of my political mates go to Torremolinos after party conference, and can I just carry on going there?
Okay, nice. Down to earth, just be honest about it. What would in fact, you've already answered this question, your Downing Street pet.
Yeah.
Your 2 dogs. I mean, you can have another pet if you want.
I like cats as well. I'm not just a dog person. Yeah, we'll have a cat.
You'd keep hold of Larry then?
Yeah.
And lastly, would you ever want to be Prime Minister, do you think?
I don't don't know. It's a lot of work, isn't it? A lot of work and a lot of scrutiny. Not that I don't work hard and I'm under scrutiny now, but it's to the nth degree. I don't know. Maybe.
Would you want to be, I mean, to put it differently, would you ever want to be leader of the Labour Party?
That's a very different question. You think about the things you have to deal with as leader of the Labour Party. It's actually probably harder than being Prime Minister. They're going to be Prime Minister without being leader of the Labour Party.
But would you?
Would I? Well, I suppose I don't want to say no. And I think that, I mean, I've heard Jeff say it before. Any politician who tells you they're not thought about doing that is probably lying. So I'm not going to lie to you.
All right. Well, thanks for entertaining the idea anyway, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks ever so much for having me.